So far, we have been looking at how to extend Edge. In this lesson, we'll be looking at how to extend a different aspect of AdonisJS, which is the HTTP response. In the intended redirect section of the end-to-end authentication course, we looked at how to redirect user to their intended URL upon logging in. So when the user logs in, we are going to check if there is an intended URL in the session. If there is, we will redirect the user to the intended URL. Otherwise, we will redirect the user to the home page. In this lesson, we are going to create a custom intended function directly on the HTTP response that we can use instead of having to repeat this anywhere we need to redirect user to their intended URL. There are two ways to extend the HTTP response. So we can either use getters or macros. In this lesson, we'll be covering both. So let's start with using getters. We can extend the HTTP response in the boot method of a service provider. And for this lesson, we'll be making use of the default app provider. So first thing first, we need to pull in the response. And we can do that from the IOC container. That is this.app.container.use. The namespace is Adonis/core/response. Let's save this in a variable, const response. Now we can make use of the response class, response.getter. The getter method accepts 3 arguments. The first one is the name of the getter, which we will call intended. Then the second method is a callback function. Inside the callback function is where we will add the implementation for the getter. In our case, we are going to get a value from the session and redirect the user to the value. So const intended URL. We can access the context using this.context. Then from the context, we can access session, then .pool. The key is intended_URL. If you have not taken the end-to-end authentication course, the intended_URL key is defined inside the auth middleware, where we are saving the intended URL in the session. What pool will do is get the session value with this key and save it inside the intended URL variable, then it will delete it from the session. So instead of having to first do session.get, then later do session.forget. So we're using just one method to do both. So now that we've gotten the intended URL, we can simply just redirect the user to it. This.context.response.redirect. Then we'll pass in the intended URL. We can also set a default value to redirect to in cases where the user is logging in directly, that is not coming from a redirect from an intended URL. We can do that by passing a second argument to the pull method. So by default, we redirect the user to the home page. Before we can start making use of this getter, we need to inform TypeScript of it. We can do that by adding the getter to the response contract interface. So let's create a new file inside the contracts directory. We're going to call the file response.ts. And inside here, we'll do declare module, followed by the namespace of the response, which is at ioc:_Adonis/core/response. Inside the module, we'll make use of the response contract interface. Response contract. Then inside the interface, we will add the intended getter. Sorry, this should be lowercase o. Now we can make use of the intended getter. So let's head over to auth controller, and I'm going to get rid of this completely and instead do return response.intended. Let's test this out in the browser. I'm going to try visiting the dashboard, which will require me to log in. I have already created an account for this lesson, so I'm just going to log in with that. Just as I expect, I'm redirected to the dashboard. And if I log out and log in directly, now I am redirected to the home page, which is the default or fallback URL we set. By default, getters are evaluated on every access. However, we can mark them as singleton, which is where the third argument to the getter method comes in. So we can pass a boolean as the third argument to mark the getter as singleton or not. So if we want this getter to be a singleton, we will set it to true. Otherwise, we can set it to false, which is the default. So that is how to extend the HTTP response using getters. Next, let's look at how to extend the response using macros. I'm going to comment this out. Again, using the response, we're going to call the macro method on it. The macro method accepts 2 arguments. The name of the macro, again, we're going to call it intended, and a callback function. The implementation will be basically the same thing. So let's grab this. I know you might be wondering, so what is the difference between a getter and a macro? The difference between macros and getters is that getters are always accessible as properties, whereas macros can both be accessible as properties and as methods. But with our implementation and use case, we will be accessing the macro as a method. So we need to update the interface and the usage. So yeah, this will be a method and we'll call it as a method as well. Let's head over to the browser and see if it's still working. I'm going to log out and log in directly. I'm logged in and redirected to the home page. Again, let me log out and try accessing the dashboard and log in. And of course, I am redirected to the dashboard. So everything is working as expected. There are times you would want to redirect users to a different URL other than the default home page. You can pass the URL to the intended method. Of course, this will throw up because the intended method is not expecting any argument. So let's refactor it to accommodate this. Let's allow the function to accept a default value, say default URI, which will be a string. And we can make use of the default value here and give it a default value of home. So if no argument is passed to the intended method, it will fall back to the home route as the default URL. And let's get rid of the type here and let TypeScript to infer it from the value. Also, we need to update the interface. Again, let's call this default URI, and it's going to be optional and must be a string. Let's try it out in the browser. Again, I'm going to log out, log in. We are redirected to the home route, which of course doesn't exist. Now let's log in from the dashboard. Now we are redirected to the dashboard as expected. Lastly, if we want to chain other methods to the intended method, we must return this here. And of course, update this to return this as well. Now we can call other methods on the response class. So that is how to extend the HTTP response using either getters or macros.